Stop the world!
The PLA is definitely actively experimenting. There's some claims that some tools have been deployed. There's definitely been demonstrations of swarming, claims of weapon systems with different degrees of autonomy, claims that decision support tools enabled by AI are being deployed, including at the theater command level.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Dave, I love today's guest, Elsa Kania. She is brilliant.
She's smarter than my phone.
I'll also bet that she's smarter than GPT-5, which is rumoured to be coming out this month. She's damn smart anyway, and we're grateful that she's devoted her efforts to understanding the Chinese military. We all know it's made huge progress in recent decades, and in terms of quantity, it's outmatching the US in some areas. But just how good is it, especially not having fought a war in decades?
Yeah, so that's really the debate that military experts around the world are having, and Elsa knows as much about it as anyone in the public realm, especially on the ways the People's Liberation Army has incorporated technology. Elsa is a PhD candidate in Harvard University's Department of Government, where she's just recently defended her dissertation, China's Command Revolution. She is an Adjunct Senior Fellow with the Center for a New American Securities, Technology and National Security Program, and she was previously a Fulbright Specialist and Non-Resident Fellow here at ASPI. When I spoke with her this week, she was recovering from running a half marathon, Liv, and I was wondering what exactly I'm doing with my life.
Me too, Dave. So, Elsa talks about how the PLA matches up against the US military, the recent history of its improvements, the concepts of informatisation and intelligentisation, the centrality of AI to its modernisation, and the Chinese view of the ethics of automating lethal force.
It's quite a mouthful, but you got it out, Liv. Well done.
Thanks, Dave.
She also talks about the significance and purpose of China's military rehearsals around Taiwan, its concept of peace disease, which translates as its own lack of real-world fighting experience, and China's overall strategy with its growing military assertiveness in various arenas.
There's a lot packed into this conversation, but it rolls along, and really Elsa is just a great source of insight into this pretty murky area. So let's take a listen.
Welcome to Stop the World, everyone. I'm here with Elsa Kania. Elsa, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
So let's start by looking at a high level at the progress that the PLA has made in recent years. The US has deemed it a pacing threat for a while now. I mean, we don't have to go through the whole history, but as a way of giving an overview to the conversation, perhaps, how would you quickly characterize the state of the PLA? Where has it made the most advances since, say, 2000? Where is it still deficient? And just in headline terms, where is it strongest?
Sure. So the PLA has achieved dramatic progress, but continues to confront considerable challenges. And I'd point to a significant expansion of Chinese cyberspace capabilities, as well as space and counter space. There's the PLA rocket force, of course, and dramatic developments in hypersonics as well. But I think some of the deficiencies may persist in the lack of operational experience, questionable capabilities of Chinese military commanders, though potentially some improvement on that front, given attempts to upgrade their training and their education and cultivation of talent. So I think assessing Chinese military power is inherently complex and uncertain. I tend to think that the truth lies somewhere in the middle between those who would dismiss the PLA as a military museum and those who would argue it's already leagues ahead of the US military. It's hard to right-size our understanding of Chinese military power, but I think it's important to both recognize the progression, but also understand that the PLA still sees itself as striving to catch up with the US military, which it regards as a powerful adversary and the benchmark for its own modernization. And there is still a level of anxiety about the US military moving ahead into new capabilities, pursuing new technologies. There's a fear of falling behind or of technology surprise, but at the same time, there does appear to be a greater degree of confidence today that the PLA is closer to closing that gap, especially when it comes to new domains and emerging capabilities, whether that is cyberspace or artificial intelligence or exciting developments in quantum technology as well. Depending on the time horizons, different capabilities may have different degrees of relevance in various contingencies, but the PLA's ambition is clear to not just pursue a strategy of catching up, of developing asymmetric capabilities to counterbalance the US military, but now looking as well to achieve the leapfrog development, so to speak, and of genuine disruptive innovation and trying to achieve an advantage or the strategic commanding heights, as Chinese military commentators often phrase it, in some of these new domains and technologies where the US does not have a clear or decisive advantage. So I think we should be skeptical sometimes of the claims in Chinese military media and propaganda, but also take these competitive challenges quite seriously.
I mean, this is a layperson's question, I suppose, but is it possible to put them side by side and say the PLA is, 70% of the way there, 80% of the way there, something like that?
I am hesitant to put a number on it in the sense that it's apples and oranges in some sense, for lack of a better metaphor, that we're talking about two militaries with very different histories, different ambitions, and optimized for different scenarios where the US military has been focused on power projection and has sort of recent experience in the Middle East primarily, which has varying degrees of relevance, contingencies in the Indo-Pacific, depending on one's vantage point, whereas the PLA does not have that contemporary operational experience and is very focused, instead of on being a global military power, on regional contingencies, specifically Taiwan. Yeah. And sort of first on counter-intervention campaigns, on preventing US military projection of power. So it's almost thesis and antithesis in some sense, where we're looking at different paradigms of military power. Of course, we've also seen the PLA try to emulate some of the hallmarks of US military power, as in the development of aircraft carriers, but the PLA is focused much more so on asymmetric capabilities and on counter-intervention and developing capabilities to target the weaknesses it recognizes in US paradigms of military power.
Yeah, okay, no, that's fair enough. Some of your work and the work of others has looked at how they've put information at the heart of their modernization. Can you just talk a little bit about that? I mean, in what sense has their focus on information really kind of, I suppose, shaped their modernization?
So I'd say that the PLA, since at least the 1990s, has really concentrated on information as a central feature of military power, focusing on information power as an enabler of combat capability and seeking to achieve information dominance in the early stages of any conflict scenario. And I'd say that is critical to how the PLA regards the form or character of conflict, and this focus on information has driven changes in Chinese military strategy and their doctrine and sort of core concepts at the heart of how the PLA is preparing to fight. And we can look back at the lessons the PLA learned from the Gulf War and from US conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and looking at sort of network-centric warfare and trying to develop their own approaches focused on what they call informationization, 信息化, which really is this transformation of warfare and of military power through information. And that has driven the development of capabilities for information operations, namely cyber, electronic, and psychological warfare, focused on targeting their adversaries' decision-making and targeting vulnerabilities in battle networks as well, and then also developing greater resiliency in their own C4ISR capabilities, their own command information systems, and trying to ensure a degree of resilience and redundancy, having seen how the US in its conflicts has often targeted those sorts of networks and systems. So this is also closely linked to concepts of sort of system of systems confrontation as a core feature of modern and future warfare, and increasingly, beyond this emphasis on informatization, there's also this focus on the impact of artificial intelligence as a new catalyst for changes in the form of warfare, which is leading to these emerging and evolving debates on intelligentisation, or the transformation of warfare based on advances in AI and related emerging technologies that are seen as an element of a revolution in military affairs. And U.S. debates on the revolution in military affairs sort of dwindled somewhat after the early 2000s, whereas the PLA has consistently seen this framing of military revolution or transformation as really pivotal to how they are approaching initially catching up in advances in information technology, and today trying to achieve a leading position in new frontiers of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. And I definitely want to come back to AI and the intelligentisation. So, I mean, from what you're saying, I mean, they're looking at it both from a point of view of information warfare in terms of operations, looking for vulnerabilities in adversaries, I suppose, information networks in order to potentially disrupt those, but also information, I suppose, harmonization within their own forces to, improve their ability to fight as a sort of coordinated and joint force, if I understand it correctly. I'm interested in, the third of those categories, what it's meant for their command and control. I mean, that was, I think their C2, as it's called, was traditionally seen as a bit ropey. They had difficulty with, I suppose, the lack of initiative shown at more junior levels, and the strategic goals set by the higher levels making their way down. And so basically their command and control was well below where they wanted it to be. What has this informationitization, if that's the word, what has that meant for their command and control in particular, and how good is it now?
So I guess I'll start with some of the self-criticisms you referenced that dating back to at least 2015, Chinese military leaders and commentators, including up to the level of Xi Jinping and sort of senior members of the Central Military Commission, were quite candid in pointing out what they saw as shortfalls in commanders' capabilities, the so-called five incapables, including that commanders at the time were, quote unquote, some commanders had difficulty understanding the intentions of leadership, of judging the battlefield situation, of decision-making in uncertain situations, and so on, and that this actually was the driver for new approaches to training focused on trying to overcome these self-assessed shortcomings and to ensure that commanders could be more capable of exercising their subjective initiative and interpreting senior leadership guidance, including understanding the party's intentions and being able to respond to more complex and dynamic battlefield situations. So I think when we hear these self-criticisms, and often sort of a tendency to echo these in debates among external observers on how to right-size Chinese military power, I think it's important to note that the PLA has been very forthright in discussing these problems and has been very targeted and focused in its efforts to overcome some of these challenges and these human elements. And certain more recent commentaries still allude to the five incapables and other self-criticisms as not fully resolved. But I'd say in the past decade, there has been a certain amount of progress, or some indicators that the more realistic training, the efforts to reform elements of their military education and cultivation of joint commanders, as well as grassroots commanders, trying to encourage them to be more creative and adaptive, are starting to gain some traction. So I do think it's important to recognize that the PLA is a learning organization, and they are adapting, they are trying to overcome the weaknesses that they recognize that relate to the peace disease that they see as a problem given their lack of contemporary operational experience. And there are reasons to be skeptical that they can fully overcome these problems, but I think it's important not to discount the possibility that they may achieve greater progress than we may appreciate. Though, of course, for those of us who watch the PLA based on PLA media and military writings, there's always the caveat that so much of the information we rely upon is generated from within the system. So we see a level of candor, but there's also can be a certain amount of distortion and obviously controls and censorship and propaganda associated with some of this representation as well. So I think it's important to be skeptical, but also recognize that the PLA has invested and aligned its training to overcome some of these previously identified deficiencies in commanders' capabilities. So that's the human element of it. From a technical perspective, there have been significant investments in the resilience and redundancy of their whole architecture of command control communications, as well as the information surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities that constitute elements of the information support that would enable precision strikes, and the stand-up of the Information Support Force in April of 2024, based on an elevation of elements of the former Strategic Support Force, I think reflects the importance and prioritization associated with continuing to advance their command information systems and the complex network information systems that are recognized as critical capabilities for current and future conflict. So, say that there have been major advances in China's deployment of space-based systems for surveillance to support strikes and targeting. There's been very redundant, robust, ground-based architecture of information networks to enable ensured communications, and continued attempts to innovate and integrate new technologies into this overall architecture of command and network information systems, focusing on improving this overall capacity for information support and including greater decision support. So there may be a tendency to turn to technology to compensate for some of these human shortfalls, but I think inherently there's also a pragmatic recognition that the complexity of contemporary operations is such that no human commander, no matter how capable, can make decisions effectively unless they have the right information and the right analytic capability and the right intelligence. So I think information support and greater intelligentisation, so to speak, in the processing of ISR and use of some of these new tools and techniques to support command decision making is also critical. So this focus on improving the human element and upgrading the technology are proceeding in parallel.
Yeah, okay. No, I was going to ask about, that parallel dimension is a really interesting one. The technology has improved, but at the same time, I suppose their philosophy, their doctrine, what you will, has shifted at the same time towards this approach of let's make sure we can see what we need to see, share the information we need to share in order to be able to make good decisions, give and receive the orders that we need to give and receive. And that's turned them, from what you're saying, into a very aware, very communicative and potentially very decisive force overall, yeah?
Absolutely. And I do think that there is this focus on integrating and reconciling these human and machine or technological dimensions of warfare. Okay. I've been asked a number of times over the years, do I think the PLA will take humans fully out of the loop and have machine intelligence commanding all operations? And I tend to be skeptical of that, but I think I always say I'm highly confident in the near term, at least one human will be in the loop for all strategic decisions, and that would be Xi Jinping personally, in his role as commander-in-chief. But when it does come to more tactical and technical operations, there appears to be a fairly flexible and pragmatic approach to leveraging emerging technologies for applications they're uniquely suited for. So, for instance, greater automation of elements of cyberspace operations, for instance, including uses of generative artificial intelligence to accelerate and enable scaling up of some of these capabilities and exploitations, I think is something we should expect to see, and some evidence there's experimentation along those lines, applying AI tools, including at the edge, to accelerate processing of intelligence, including from some of their space systems. It's something we can expect to see, even some startups launching what they're describing as AI-enabled satellites. So think a lot of very technologically deterministic or solutionistic approaches to leveraging technology where it has certain strengths, but there also appear to be fairly nuanced debates within the PLA about the strengths and weaknesses of machine intelligence relative to human intelligence, and the recognition that there can be certain biases or issues of safety or surety of these systems, which necessitates a continued human involvement in command decision-making at the operational and strategic levels, even if certain tactical applications, elements of air and missile defense, for instance, or aspects of swarming, suicide drones and the like could be more fully automated. So I think there's not a single answer or a single approach in terms of how the PLA may use these tools or may approach integrating technologies. A lot of this will depend on different domains, applications, and the evolving maturity of these capabilities.
You've sort of anticipated where I wanted to go next in a wonderful way. I mean, that is a really just a fascinating insight into the way they're adopting AI and automation. And at this point, I just want to give you a quick shout out for the 2019 ASPI report that you wrote on Chinese-Russian cooperation in areas like AI. So fully 6 years ago, not just were you anticipating the China-Russia cooperation, which of course has become one of the biggest issues strategists are considering in 2025, but also the importance of things like AI and other advanced technology. So a quick shout out there. But just, I mean, that's thrown up an ethical question for me. I mean, it's one that's as old as the hills, but the basic idea of using lethal force without a human in the loop has generally been seen as a red line for militaries who are answerable to democratic systems. Do you think that is not an ethical red line for the PLA?
So my impression would be that the PLA is very pragmatic in their approach. There are debates in Chinese military writings about ethics, about law of armed conflict, about the benefits or drawbacks of having a human in, on, or out of the loop, but with the caveat that these days discussing directly with Chinese military counterparts is more challenging. My impression of these debates is that the PLA's approach is relatively pragmatic, and I suppose I keep coming back to that characterization because there does appear to be a degree of concern with law of armed conflict, legitimacy in use of force, a desire to have precise and accurate targeting as opposed to great risk of collateral damage. And the PLA is a professional military. They're not looking to cause mass casualty events with out-of-control autonomous weapons. They want to ensure that their weapon systems that may have various degrees of automation or autonomy built in will hit the targets they intend for them to hit.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is a active debate, or there appears to be ongoing consideration of the relative advantages and disadvantages of having human decision makers in, on, or out of the loop at different echelons for different instances of employment of weapon systems. But I think the notion that a human has to be pulling the trigger, so to speak, metaphorically, appears to be less of a moral red line. And I think that there is, without weighing into these debates in a US or Australian context, I think there is something to be said for a recognition that simply having a human, quote unquote, in the loop is not enough for the decision to be an ethical one. I expect these will continue to be active debates across multiple militaries as the technology evolves, as the calculus of risk evolves, and much may depend as well on the operational environment and the types of decisions or capabilities that could be employed, for instance, in urban warfare would differ greatly from the considerations if we're thinking about naval warfare or maritime operations. So I think the level of complexity and congestion of the environment may be a factor, and I suspect the debates will continue evolving in the PLA as here, but the overwhelming considerations driving the PLA's approach appear to be pragmatism and the question of which approach is technically and operationally advantageous as opposed to more abstract notions of red lines morally.
Yeah. No, you're right. It's far from a simple discussion. You wrote recently about the sort of jolt that China and including Xi Jinping personally got from the famous AI battle between Alph Go and the then Go world champion Lee Sedol, and the trajectory. I mean, famously, Alph Go defeated Lee Sedol, much to everybody's surprise, and it was a huge moment, really, well, across all of Asia, where Go was this ancient and much loved and much played game, probably missed in much of the West other than in circles that were paying a lot of attention to AI. But you described recently that sort of, set China on a trajectory. It was a sort of I hate the term Sputnik moment, but it was a bit of a Sputnik moment for China. Just talk us through that a little bit and the trajectory that it set China on in terms of, I suppose, building AI capabilities including for military purposes.
Sure. So looking back at Alph Go and looking at the PLA's reaction at that time, there did appear to be a catalytic impact to some extent in terms of the recognition that this was a demonstration of how quickly advances in AI were progressing and the fact that an AI system could defeat the world's top human players in a game that did center on decision-making, stratagems, and complex calculations. And I think the salience of the game of Go to some extent may have been a factor there, but also the notion that during some of these matches with Lee Sedol and other players, Alph Go started to introduce moves or plays that humans hadn't conceived of in the totality of the history of the game of Go. So I think that...
The famous move 37, I think, wasn't it? Where everyone was so aghast and everyone thought that the computer had made a terrible, disastrous mistake, and it turned out to be a brilliant strategy that, like you say, no one had ever used before in the human playing of the game.
Indeed. And as someone who was watching PLA debates and writings at that time, and initially having looked back, and this is history now, but to PLA's responses to the third offset strategy that was launched around 2014 and through 2015, when I was initially started tracking these issues, the PLA both saw the strategic and operational potential of these developments in the context of their concerns about U.S. defense innovation initiatives, and believed there could be unique utility to integrating AI into future command decision-making. And this prompted some of the early debates that had harkened back to the PLA's earlier interest in thinking about how technology could enable and upgrade command decision-making on command as a complex system with human and machine elements integrated, and this drive to have a more scientific approach to warfare and to command decision-making. And Alph Go in that context did spark a lot of debate and some apparent initial efforts and experimentation with integrating AI and developing tools for decision support. There's also a lot of efforts in wargaming coming out of institutions like the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the PLA's National Defense University, National University of Defense Technology, a lot of focus on trying to develop AI agents that could play war games, and both AI versus human and AI versus AI, machine versus machine confrontation as means of testing and validating how effectively AI tools or agents could be used in military decision-making, at least in a games playing context. Of course, there's a great difference between even the most sophisticated of computerized war games relative to the complexity of an actual real-world operational environment, but this was at least seen as a stepping stone or proof of concept to validate how some of these AI agents or systems could start to be developed and how they could be paired with human players, and that centaur-type approach to decision-making as well. So I do think that this was one of several moments in the PLA's recent history that did draw their attention to the potential of AI. And I do find it ironic that this moment was not seen very much as of military relevance in a US or generally Western context, but did spark a certain amount of debate in the PLA, as did more recently their reaction to ChatGPT.
Yep.
And concern that at a moment where Chinese leaders and observers had started to be more confident, they were closer to drawing even with US AI developments. ChatGPT, I think, was another moment of shock. Again, I also hesitate to say a Sputnik moment, but certainly a moment that had some catalytic impacts in driving efforts to think about how large language models and generative AI generally could contribute to future military capabilities, whether in in intelligence, in command decision making, or in other aspects of planning and strategizing. So there is a degree of reactivity in how the PLA has responded to global developments in AI and how closely they've monitored advances, especially in a U.S. context, concern always about the U.S. as a powerful potential adversary and fear of technology surprise. That's a consistent theme. But there's also efforts to, beyond scanning global military and technological developments, to try to anticipate where some of these trends are going, and not just to react and be a fast follower, but to be more of a leader in original innovation and to design future warfare or design the parameters for the future battlefield. So the PLA is, I think, a ways to go in truly achieving that, but there's certainly an ambition and very close study of technology and of some of the theoretical implications as well.
Yeah. Well, we'll try not to blame DeepMind and OpenAI too much for catalyzing China's military modernization efforts. Is there a way to, in an apples-to-apples sense, say who is doing a better job between the PLA and the US military at actually integrating AI, including in a human-machine teaming sense?
That is a fantastic question, and I don't have a great answer. I think it is
if anyone has it, you do.
Well, it is an aspect of ongoing research for me. I look more at the PLA side of the equation, so I'm less confident making a comparison since I'm less fully familiar with the US context here. But I guess I'd say, by way of caveat, I think for both militaries, we are still at a stage where there is a lot of experimentation. There are a lot of efforts to have proofs of concept, to try to test and validate what systems or use cases and applications can be feasible and advantageous. There's a lot of very diverse efforts across every application imaginable, just about. And at the risk of sounding cynical or flippant, I think that sort of just add AI is, I think, a tendency sometimes of military leaders in multiple systems to sort of have this level of enthusiasm or exuberant expectations of these technologies that sometimes start to confront the realities that when you are trying to implement complex advanced technologies within military bureaucracies, in any cultural context, there will be obstacles and there will be difficulties with how you manage data, how you upskill your personnel at different echelons to use these tools effectively, how you start to develop new procedures and parameters for integrating these technologies into operations, including in training and exercises, and recognizing some of the problems that arise. So I guess I'd say, ask me again in a couple years. Sure. I think the PLA is definitely actively experimenting. There's some claims that some tools have been deployed. There's definitely been demonstrations of swarming, claims of weapon systems with different degrees of autonomy, claims that decision support tools enabled by AI are being deployed, including at the theater command level. A lot of applications, I think, or some of the earliest applications we'll see will be in virtual domains where it's harder to measure or observe from the outside, whether that is in accelerated processing of data to enable enhanced intelligence capabilities or integrating generative AI for cognitive domain or cyberspace operations. So I think some of these earliest manifestations may be in virtual domains or in some of these information-related functions and capabilities. There's been some indications of AI adoption in different aspects of cyberspace operations, and that could, including for malware development, social engineering, and the like, a generation of content for more targeted psychological operations. So I think some of the near-term applications we'll observe in competition or confrontation will be along those lines. How effectively certain capabilities are being integrated into operational decision-making are harder to observe from the outside. So it's easier to point to the indications of effort and progress, harder to say how effective or successful these initiatives are. And I guess I'd add as well that there is, I think, a greater extent of uncertainty about the military balance, because these qualitative advancements could have significant applications and implications for the future of warfare. but there is an inherent difficulty in measurement. It's hard to count or hard to measure how much having a certain AI modeler system deployed enhances targeting, if it's, say, an automatic target recognition in Chinese missiles. It's hard to measure or count or evaluate in the abstract. And I think this also highlights why we need greater integration of subject matter and technical expertise. I'll be the first to admit I'm a political scientist by training. I am always trying to continue learning and upskilling myself. I'm actually here at Berkeley for an AI red teaming bootcamp this week, which has been a fantastic experience so far. So definitely a proponent of lifelong learning for all of us to keep pace with this. But I do think that for those of us who've been observers of military affairs, I think how we calculate, or how military strategists and decision makers calculate the future military balance, may depend more and more on complex technologies for which the metrics are difficult and uncertain, which I think does also increase the risk of some kind of miscalculation or misperceptions that could arise with that new fog of technology, so to speak.
I'm envious of where you are now. And I'm just picking up on your point. I think that, the challenges that you were referring to there of, just add AI and assuming that integration and adoption is straightforward is a challenge that, in fact, large organizations, military, private sector, civilian, of all kinds, are finding. And it's fascinating that one of the bottlenecks, as it turns out, is simply organizational readjustment in order to integrate AI. It's interesting. But lest I go down a rabbit hole of my own digging there, there are a couple of other things that I do desperately want to cover off on while we're here. And one is just, you've touched on the PLA's lack of, real world warfighting experience, and you've sort of indicated that is being overcome in some ways. How relevant or significant does that remain? And to what extent do you think that the rehearsals around Taiwan, as Admiral Paparo, Indo-PACOM commander, has described them, to what extent are those actually about practical experience and learning and actually improving in that real world scenario?
The PLA is quite candid in admitting to the challenges its lack of contemporary operational experience can present, the so-called peace disease, which is often referenced in commentaries, which are often accompanied by exhortations for more combat realistic or actual combat training. And the extent to which the PLA, especially the Eastern Theater Command, in its continual presence and operations around Taiwan, can get experience in the likely operational environment for its priority scenario and can validate command relations, complex multi-domain synchronization in some of these pressure operations. And that is perhaps at least a partial mechanism of overcoming that. So this focus on greater sophistication in training, on the integration between peacetime employment of military forces with likely wartime contingencies, that all is aimed at overcoming some of these factors, as are the emphases on wargaming, simulations, and this fairly scientific approach to trying to anticipate some of the challenges that could arise in a future conflict scenario. I think military observers have been quite wrong in, for instance, assessments of Russian capabilities. So as somebody who studies the PLA, I tend to be quite humble and cognizant of the limitations in our community's perspective and what we see and don't see. But I do think the fact that the PLA, especially the Eastern Theater Command, which has been responsible for orchestrating these complex pressure operations, has been seemingly successful, at least as portrayed in their own media, in undertaking these named exercises and major campaigns around Taiwan that is seemingly advantageous in their familiarization, in their capacity to rehearse, as Admiral Paparo has characterized it, and as contributes to overall readiness. So I definitely don't think we should dismiss peace disease, and certainly the PLA does not dismiss this as an impediment, but so too do our own militaries not have experiences that quite align with the complexity of what a future conflict in this theater could entail.
I hadn't heard the term peace disease before. It's a bloody depressing phrase to hear.
Indeed.
You make a good point about the Russian military there as well, and how it reflects on the humility we should show in making bold predictions about any fighting force. Okay, are you prepared to say how ready you think the PLA is to mount a successful blockade or even invasion of Taiwan at the moment?
So I would say the current posture, as apparent and well documented, of the PLA in the vicinity of Taiwan gives them the optionality to transition into a blockade or quarantine should they choose to do so. And the strategic calculus or rationale is something of a question, but in terms of the extent to which the PLA has expanded and attempted to normalize their posture around Taiwan is significant and has expanded dramatically, especially since Speaker Pelosi's visit, which the PLA chose to respond to with massive pressure operations that they justified as a proportional reaction, but did create a sea change and a step towards expanding their posture in ways that give them that optionality and capability to transition into a blockade. And certainly that has been some of the signaling, not so subtle in some cases, associated with elements of their Joint Sword or Straight Thunder exercise series. So a blockade or quarantine, and there would almost certainly be some kind of legal warfare or political warfare justification accompanying it as an attempt to rationalize it, that would not be all that operationally challenging based on how they are already postured. And I think this incremental expansion in attempts to change facts on the water has been significant, but that is a far cry from readiness for an actual invasion. And I do tend to be of the school of thought that although the threat of an invasion is not trivial and shouldn't be dismissed, there are many tools and techniques through which the PLA could escalate their posture, presence, and pressure around Taiwan in an attempt to deter or intimidate or attempt to force acquiescence prior to attempting an invasion, because an invasion would be incredibly challenging. So the PLA has been evidently directed by Xi Jinping to be prepared by 2027, which again, I think often this point gets conflated in some of the media coverage and public debates, but becoming capable by 2027 does not imply an intention or a deadline or timeline centered on 2027, but the benchmark has seemingly been established as their centenary objective of becoming a powerful military on a course to becoming a world-class force and assuring China's national rejuvenation by mid-century, and so on and so forth, that they are seeking to have the capability to invade, including as a means of attempts to coerce Taiwan. But I think I would suspect that the PLA today is quite a ways from actually becoming confident it has the ability to do so, or a decision to invade would be a major gamble on the part of Chinese leadership, and there would be non-trivial risks in that choice. So I do think that there are reasons for concern. We could see orthogonal approaches or horizontal escalation or different techniques trying to target Taiwan and also trying to target US calculus, since I think ultimately Chinese leaders and observers appear to regard US decisions and US military power as the primary, if not predominant, obstacle to their capacity to achieve unification, as they term it. So I think we can expect to see more creative techniques and attempts to impact US calculus or Taiwan's decision making prior to any actual attempted invasion, but that does not mean that the threat is not quite serious.
Yeah, fascinating. All right, and now, Elsa, to wrap up, I'm going to be a bit grossly unfair here, but I think you're so good on this stuff that you can do it. But I'm going to ask you to, in roughly a minute or so, taking account of China's military modernization, its activity around Taiwan, its activity in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, construction of bases further afield globally. How would you quickly describe Beijing's overall military strategy in the service of its broader national interest?
So I'd say that when it comes to activities within the first island chain, East and South China Seas, Taiwan Strait, Chinese leaders are trying to transform China into a major and great maritime power that has a dominant position within its near seas, within the first island chain, and can exercise effective control of those waters. I do believe and am concerned that Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, especially regard unification with or de facto coercive annexation of, if necessary, of Taiwan by mid-century as among the benchmarks for national rejuvenation, or the Xi Jinping's speeches and statements have articulated that objective. And I do think that Chinese military strategy and capabilities development are aimed at counter-intervention, and namely countering what Chinese leaders regard as the potential for US intervention that is seen as an obstacle to achieving these objectives, as an animating driver of this asymmetric counterbalancing strategy, as some Chinese military textbooks describe it. So I do think that there are efforts to achieve incremental advancement towards these aims. Xi Jinping, in some of his statements and a growing number of commentaries, highlight peacetime employment of military forces as an important element of this approach, of as the PLA becomes a more capable military, the ability to brandish that power and to achieve deterrent or coercive effects on China's neighbors in ways that strengthen their position in some of these territorial disputes in the region is emerging as a major feature of their approach as well. And I do think that ultimately this is driving to this ambition by mid-century to be a world-class or global first-class military, which appears to imply not only relative dominance in the region, but a transformation of the military balance. The Chinese strategists and observers appear to be becoming increasingly confident they are on track to achieve, and that not only this transformation of the cross-strait balance, but also a dramatic alteration of the US-China military balance that is often accompanied by, or often accompanies, some of these claims that the overall balance of power, of comprehensive national power, is shifting in China's favor. I believe there is a degree of overconfidence in some cases that is juxtaposed with intense insecurities on other fronts. But the ambition is clear, and although Xi Jinping gets a lot of credit for what has been unveiled, sometimes dramatically, during his tenure, I do think that elements of these objectives have been consistent across multiple generations of Chinese leadership. There are certain continuities going back to Deng Xiaoping and his initial emphasis on science and technology, on military modernization, on becoming capable of more effective command of the PLA and shaping it into a more modern fighting force. So I do think there's been continuity over time, but especially under Xi Jinping's leadership, there has been this focus on an innovation-driven approach to economic development and military modernization, and this strong emphasis on technology as critical to reshaping the balance of power. So I'd say that a feature that is a core element of China's military, economic, and overall national strategy is betting on technologies that could be decisive to the future, to the fourth industrial revolution, to this emerging revolution in military affairs. And the desired end state does appear to be the PLA not just being on par with the US military, but really being at the forefront in a new era of warfare.
Okay, brilliant wrap up. You nailed it. Thank you. And I realize I forgot to throw their cyber activity in there as one of the examples, but that's entirely on me. So my omission, and we'll make that a subject for next time we talk, which hopefully, again, we will be able to do. But Elsa Kania, look, thank you so much for joining us. That's hugely insightful into the way the PLA is modernising its military, and it was a real pleasure having you on Stop the World.
Thank you so much, and looking forward to continuing the conversation again sometime.
Thanks for listening, folks. We will be back next week with another episode. Bye for now.